With a month before the next race at the Nürburgring, there was plenty going on in the world. South Africa had last year enacted constitutional changes that combined the offices of Prime Minister and President into one powerful position with sole responsibility for matters of national concern, crucially including foreign policy and race relations. These now came into effect, with Prime Minister P.W. Botha taking the new role. The UK and China signed an agreement to return Hong Kong to China by 1997. Hong Kong Island and Kowloon Peninsula had been ceded by China to Britain, not exactly voluntarily, after the Opium Wars of the 1840s, while the area of the colony known as the New Territories had been leased from China for 99 years in 1898. With the end of this lease approaching, Britain approached China to decide what would happen next, and the end result of negotiations was that the entire colony would return to Chinese sovereignty, but that Hong Kong would hold a special status within China, with its democratic governmental systems respected for 50 years following the handover. Nonetheless, the news caused anxiety in Hong Kong, and many Hong Kongers moved to the UK over the coming years. The Princess of Wales gave birth to her second son, Henry Charles Albert David, universally known as Prince Harry. Professor Alec Jeffreys at the University of Leicester was looking at X-rays of a DNA experiment and realised he could see both similarities and differences in the DNA of different members of his technician's family. It was what he described as a eureka moment and led to the invention of genetic fingerprinting. And there was plenty to keep TV viewers of all ages occupied too. Long-running US comedy series Happy Days and Three's Company both ended after 7- and 10-year runs respectively, but to replace them there was stylish action series Miami Vice, crime series Murder, She Wrote, fantasy drama Highway to Heaven, influential comedy The Cosby Show, and horror anthology Tales from the Dark Side, all debuting this month, while kids could enjoy new series like Transformers, Punky Brewster, The Muppet Babies, The Snorks, and Voltron. Not entirely new, but revived after a break of a few years, quiz show Jeopardy returned with a new host, Alex Trebek, who would host the show until his death in 2020. Across the pond, British viewers would have to wait for most of those, but one-off drama Threads, which showed the aftermath of nuclear war in horrific detail, caused much discussion, while younger audiences could for the first time watch the model railway shenanigans of Thomas the Tank Engine, narrated by Beatle Ringo Starr. There were some developments in the F1 world too. Nigel Mansell signed terms with Williams, with Derek Warwick reportedly having turned down the drive, and Lotus renewed their contract with Renault for another 3 years. And the Michelin company had announced their withdrawal from the sport at the end of a very successful year, which would leave Brabham, McLaren, Renault, Tolman and Ligier looking for new rubber. Michelin-shod cars had won every race except Belgium and Dallas this year, so they were definitely going out on a high note. But most of the discussion approaching the race was about the circuit, and on one man in particular. In the 1920s, a new circuit was built in the Eifel Hills between the Rhine and the Belgian border to replace the public road circuit that had been used for the Eifel Rennen race. The circuit was built around the village and castle of Nürburgring, and the original track was a long cross-country circuit which could be divided into two sections: the longer, more challenging 22.8 km 14-mile Nordschleife and the shorter, safer 7.7 km 4.8 mile Südschleife. Until 1929, Grand Prix took place on the whole track, then switched to using the Nordschleife alone. Post-war, Grand Prix cars returned to the Nordschleife, and it became known as a hugely challenging circuit. Dangerous, yes, but a supreme test of driving skill and nerve. Phil Hill in 1961 was the first man to lap it in under 8 minutes in the famous Sharknose Ferrari, and over the next decade cars got quicker and quicker, and when Jackie Stewart won in 1968 through fog and driving rain, he memorably nicknamed the circuit the Green Hell. Drivers, led by Stewart, demanded and got amendments to the circuit in 1971. Armco barriers were added, bumps and jumps smoothed out, part of the track widened and straightened, but even with these amendments the circuit was starting to become unsuitable. The track needed 5 times as many marshals as any other circuit, which cost a lot of money, and the sheer length of the track made it difficult to televise. By the start of the 1976 season, it had already been decided that the German Grand Prix would move to Hockenheim from then on. And then Niki Lauda's fiery crash at the 1976 race, a rain-sodden event he'd tried to persuade the other drivers to boycott, nearly cost him his life, left him with lifelong burn scars, and hammered the final nail into the coffin of the Nürburgring Nordschleife as a Grand Prix circuit. It was just impossible to bring such a long circuit up to the modern safety standards required, and so in 1981 ground was broken on a new circuit on the site of the old Südschleife, which was finished and opened in 1984. The new track, known as the GP-Strecke, was officially just one layout of the Nürburgring alongside the still existing Nordschleife, but many pundits felt it was a bit too Mickey Mouse to really deserve the name and took to calling it the Eifelring, or more sarcastically, the Ersatzring. A 12-lap demonstration event, the Nürburgring Race of Champions, was staged in July, pitting stars of present and past against each other in a 12-lap blast in Mercedes' new model of 190e, which was won by Ayrton Senna, ahead of Niki Lauda and Carlos Reutemann, and the circuit was ready to go. As the Grand Prix circus arrived at the circuit, all talk was therefore of one man, Niki Lauda. If the 1984 season was a Hollywood script, he would return here to the scene of his near death, triumphantly overcome his demons to win his third world title. But this isn't Hollywood, and Alain Prost in particular would be keen to write his own script and take the championship to the last race in Portugal. Prost couldn't win the title here, but he could lose it, while Nelson Piquet, enjoying his racing with no pressure on his shoulders, was always game to spoil the party for the McLaren boys. One interesting factor that might also come into play was the continuing fallout of the Tyrrell saga. Moves were afoot to persuade FISA to retrospectively disqualify the team from all the races they'd taken part in and move up anyone who'd finished behind, which, if it happened, would give Prost one extra point. Elsewhere on the grid, Manfred Winkelhock had walked out of the ATS team at Monza, and a couple of days later, Günther Schmidt had announced that he'd been fired. So Gerhard Berger was now the sole representative of the team, and there were just 26 cars going for 26 grid slots, so everyone was guaranteed to qualify. Senna was back in the Tollman, with Johansson retained and now in car number 20, with the team apparently viewing him as a potential full-time driver for 1985. Friday qualifying was cold and drizzly, and the McLaren team were having all sorts of problems, with both Lauda and Prost having car trouble, and Niki having to use the spare, which was also plagued with a persistent misfire. Saturday was changeable, with the morning wet, then it dried up over lunch, and then, just as the teams were resetting for dry, the heavens opened again, for good this time. So while most drivers went out to get some experience on the new circuit in the conditions, it was Friday's times that decided the grid. It was, once again, a Piquet Prost front row, with Tambay and Rosberg behind them, the Finns' Honda having blown just as he finished the lap, followed by the Ferraris of Alboreto and Arnoux, a much better qualifying for them. Then Warwick, Mansell, Patrese and Fabi. And what of Lauda? 15th, with an awful lot to do come race day. Not as much as Elio De Angelis right back in 23rd, sharing a row with Mauro Baldi on his return to the Spirit cockpit, while Stefan Johansson brought up the rear after having his own car troubles. Sunday morning was sunny but still cold, and Prost had an accident in practice when he spun at the end of the lap, missed the tyre wall and hit a course car instead. With Lauda having already bagged the spare, the mechanics worked feverishly to rebuild the thankfully minor damage and replace the engine, which had eaten a lot of dirt. But come the start, everyone was ready and on the grid, with the Lotus team deploying an innovation in the shape of electrically heated tyre blankets against the cold weather, and a crowd of 60,000 had made their way to the Eiffel for the race. The crowds in practice were considerably smaller thanks to the awful weather, but there were campers, tents and barbecues in evidence as the hardy fans made a weekend of it. The lights went red, then green, and away they went, Prost getting away quicker than Piquet, and Tambay going around the outside to slot in second. But while the cameras were watching the leaders, Senna rear-ended Rosberg under braking as the Finn was slow off the line, and triggered an accident that took out those two, as well as Ghinzani, Berger and Sierra. At the end of lap 1, Prost still led from Tambay, who had Piquet tucked up behind, then Warwick and the Ferraris in pursuit, while Lauda had climbed to 9th already. Teo Fabi was seen being towed by a course car, but presumably managed to bump start the Brabham as the marshals unhitched him and he sped off under his own power, though he might be disqualified for receiving aid, but that was for the clerk of the course to decide. By lap 2, Lauda was up to 7th and made it 6th past Arnoux on the next lap, while Prost pulled away from Tambay, who looked like he was holding up Piquet. Another man on the move was Elio De Angelis, who'd fairly scythed through the field from 23rd and was now 9th, while his teammate Mansell had bogged down at the start and gone the other way and was languishing in 21st. Michele Alboreto proved a tougher nut for Lauda to crack, and the Austrian sat on the gearbox of the Ferrari for lap after lap as Prost extended his lead further, and they began to lap the backmarkers. The gap was nearly 20 seconds from Prost to Lauda on lap 17, with the order Prost, Tambay, Piquet, Warwick, Alboreto and Lauda, with Arnoux 7th and De Angelis now 8th. In fact, Warwick, Alboreto and Lauda were having a terrific scrap over 4th, with first Alboreto having a look at the Renault, then Lauda having a look at the Ferrari in turn. As the three came up to lap Gartner and Baldi on lap 23, Warwick passed the Spirit, but Alboreto was balked in the corner. Lauda pulled out to take advantage, but the next corner was on them already, and he braked, too sharply, and spun. He kept it running and rejoined, still sixth and right ahead of De Angelis, with a lot of ground to make up. He didn't have to worry about Elio for long though, as the Lotus dropped out with overheating on lap 25, and a couple of laps later, Lafitte ended yet another miserable weekend for Williams with yet another smoking Honda. As the race approached half-distance, the order was much as it had been, with Prost leading Tambay and Piquet by some 14 seconds, then Warwick and Alboreto running together about the same distance again behind them, and then Lauda a lonely 10 seconds away from them in 6th place, over 40 seconds off Prost, who was still slowly pulling away. Mansell, meanwhile, had emulated his teammate by moving up through the field, and was now up to 8th place behind Arnoux' Ferrari. Both Rams went out with turbo problems within 2 laps of each other, as Mansell moved ahead of Arnoux, and Tambay was now also starting to slow. On lap 43, Tambay had lost ground to Piquet, who surged past into second, and 4 laps later the unlucky Patrick pulled in with a failure in his fuel system, by which time he was already down to 6th. With Tambay out, Piquet was now charging, but was 30 seconds behind Prost, with a lot of work to do in the remaining 20 laps. Behind Nelson, Warwick had been holding 3rd, but Alboreto finally got through off camera and set off in pursuit of the Brabham. Mansell's comeback drive was done with a turbo fire on lap 51, an impatient Nigel putting the fire out himself rather than watch the marshals faff around with the extinguisher any longer. Lauda had by now caught Warwick and was angling for 4th place, while Alboreto was taking lumps out of Piquet's lead. Soon enough there were 2 close battles in the top 6, between Piquet and Alboreto over 2nd, and between Warwick and Lauda over 4th. Lauda was keen to get that extra point, with the prospect of Prost being awarded one by Fieser after the race, and took Warwick when Derek made a bit of a pudding of the last corner under pressure. As it happened, he needn't have bothered. Warwick's Renault engine started making a noise like a sewing machine, and he dropped back before retiring on lap 61. Prost came home to win the European Grand Prix and take the championship down to the last race for the 4th year in a row. Behind him, Piquet and Alboreto were both running on fumes, and while the cameras were watching Prost, Alboreto snuck past a faltering Piquet into 2nd, as Nelson weaved his car to slosh just that little bit more fuel into the engine. Both cars coasted to a stop just across the line. The drivers climbed out and gave each other a friendly shrug, as Eno pulled up next to them, shortly to be joined by De Cesaris. Lauda finished 4th, with Arnoux and Patrese picking up the last points, so the gap between the 2 championship contenders going into the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril in 2 weeks' time was 4.5 points, which could be reduced to 3.5 at the plenary session of FISA in the week following the race. Alboreto's 2nd runner-up spot in succession bumped him up in the standings to 5th, while the battle for best non-McLaren driver was really hotting up, with De Angelis now just 1.5 points ahead of Piquet, 2.5 ahead of Alboreto, and 3.5 ahead of Arnoux. Even Warwick in 7th could still finish 3rd overall if he won and none of the others ahead of him scored, which seemed unlikely on current form, but as the BBC's Murray Walker was so fond of saying in his race commentaries, anything can happen in Formula 1, and it usually does.